My guest today is Peter Zaman, partner at HFW, based in Singapore. Peter is regarded as one of the foremost experts in carbon markets law. He has been active in climate finance and environmental products since 2004. Over the past 20 years, it's fair to say that Peter has experienced the ups and downs of carbon markets version 1.0 under the CDM and EU ETS. Today, he plays a key role in advocating for the development of robust and sustainable legal frameworks to, as in his words, build back better the carbon markets version 2.0. I hope you enjoy the episode. Peter.
Hey, Renee.
Welcome to Alibar, and it's wonderful to see you again here in Singapore. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been watching your programs and episodes with great interest.
Oh, I'm glad, and I've had a lot of requests for people to feature you as one of the foremost legal experts in the market for quite some time. So it's a real privilege to actually get to sit down with you. We caught up recently at the Carbon Forward conference a couple of months back, and we had a really amazing conversation that I hope that we can recapture some of that magic on film. If you'll indulge me, just to give context to you, obviously you're incredibly well known to people in the carbon market, but there's a wider audience that we seem to have tapped, which is folks that are interested about carbon markets that are sort of just getting into this space for the first time. Can you indulge me just giving a little bit of background about yourself and how your journey has evolved over the past, the few decades that you've been in this space?
Sure. I would say it's definitely a journey, but I would also say it's not an easy journey, right?
Right.
So you got to rewind the clock a little bit to try and see the world as I saw it back in 2004 as a relatively young legal associate in the market in London at the time, when, like every other ambitious young lawyer, you're trying to find your way in the world.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, I had a background in doing financial derivatives work and structured finance work. And it was a very sophisticated skill set, really, at that point. And because I was ambitious and I wanted to find my niche, at the time I was in a different law firm than the one I'm in now. And it was a highly specialized London law firm. And actually, if you weren't specialized and you didn't have your own niche, it was hard to build your business case.
Sure.
So I was looking for a niche. I won't say for 1 minute I was a passionate carbon markets evangelist at the point. I fell into it. If I'm being brutally honest, I fell into it because
many of us all did.
Yeah, and look, it's
serendipity.
It's what you discover very, very soon after you get into carbon as a subject or carbon as a topic, or in my case, carbon as a legal topic, is that it's quite fascinating. It's an area where it doesn't quite fit within the world of financial products. It doesn't fit in the world of commodities. And it's somewhere in this hybrid between the twos, and different people imagine it as being different things. So for somebody who had a financial derivatives background, who was looking for a business case, who had picked commodities as a business case, in a time when the London market was treating it as a commodity because they were trading it under the EU ETS for the very, very first time in 2004, when my commodity clients for whom I was doing gas and power derivatives work said to me, "We trade gas and power. We know how to do that. We don't know how to trade carbon. We need you to help us understand this." So I fell into it at a time when, frankly, my clients were asking me to look into it, and at a time when nobody else really had any more advantage over me of knowing more about it than I did. What I soon discovered when I got into the market is that the people who were in the market already ahead of me came from a background of Kyoto Protocol advisory work. And the Kyoto Protocol is an environmental treaty. So environmental lawyers were typically the people who understood Kyoto Protocol frameworks. And for me, I didn't know anything about it at the time. But I learned. But I learned it from the perspective of having a financial and commodities trading market background, as opposed to somebody who came at it from an environmental law background. So one of the consequences of my markets background is that when people started trading EU allowances as a commodity product within the market space, my skill set was a more natural fit to help deal with the issues that a new market was dealing with. So the EU ETS, we talk about it today as this wonderful success story, but it's a success story that's had its own ups and downs long before it got to where it is today.
Yeah.
And for somebody who was there right at the beginning, you live through those ups and downs as part of it. And actually, as a lawyer, in a world where everything has been done and dusted before you arrived in the landscape, to be able to be somebody who's there at a point where things are new, there are unknowns, and you can innovate and you can contribute to the growth of that, it was a very, very exciting thing to do. So, going back to 2008, 2009, by which time I'd already become a partner, things like, how do you deal with a stolen EU allowance? When somebody hacks your registry account, does somebody who's an innocent buyer acquire title to it? If there's been a VAT fraud associated with carbon products, EU allowances, where does the liability lie and how do you deal with that? How do you solve the problem? How do you build registry infrastructure? How does the Kyoto Protocol's CDM mechanism interact with the EU ETS? How do you link the two markets? All of these questions were live questions for when I was getting into the carbon markets in what people now call Carbon Markets 1.0. And it was a very, very interesting period of time because everybody was learning on the job. Everybody was trying to say, well, what if we do it this way? And then somebody like me would come along and say, well, I have another way of doing it. Why don't we let the clients choose which of the two ways they prefer?
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I had a particular viewpoint compared to some of my peers at the time is that I came from that markets background. And for me, that ethos that carbon as an asset class is an important thing in the battle against climate change because it creates a reference price, which means it's there to try and drive market behavior, ultimately is why I believe that coming from a markets background, the perspective that I bring to the table is always going to be different from anybody coming from a different perspective, different background, right? Mm-hmm. When the Obama administration decided that we're not going to extend the Kyoto Protocol and we're going to replace it with something, and in 2009, we didn't know what that something was. We found out in Paris in 2015 that it was going to be the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. The reality was that the market dried up relatively quickly. A lot of good people had come into the market with the expectation that this market in Carbon Markets 1.0 was going to grow into this, at the time, $20 billion a year market. That was the number being branded about back then. And then when the Paris Agreement was merely a glint in people's eyes and they didn't know what it was, and even when the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, it was, well, it doesn't kick start until 2021. You're into this world where, well, what's going to happen for the next 10 years? Yeah. So all the people, and very, very good people who worked with me, were part of my team, who were associates, all said, the problem I have, Peter, is that I know the world has now changed. I know people don't want to do carbon, but this is what I love doing. And if this is what I love doing, I'm going to go find some other place to do it. I can't do it in a law firm environment where we're under pressure to nonetheless generate work, even though the market's not there to support it.
Yeah.
So I watched the rug being proverbially pulled out from underneath a lot of legal practitioners, like myself at the time, where the markets kind of disappeared around you overnight. So I took the view that actually, what skills am I going to need whenever the carbon market comes back to do this job better? So I chose, in the diversification path that I did, to pick the skills that I knew I would find necessary. So even though I could have gone in one direction and maximized my income generating capacity, I consciously chose to go to areas where I could acquire new skills. And then you just wait. Then you just wait, as I did, until 2019 when the phone starts ringing again. And then we're into the world of Carbon Markets 1.0.
Peter, thanks for that background. Really interesting. You've taken us through essentially the evolution, not only of your journey, but also that of the Carbon Markets 1.0. I'm just curious to get a take from you in terms of the type of work and that continuous evolution under, let's say, the new architecture of Carbon Markets 2.0. Can you give us some context there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, in 2050, when Paris Agreement was finally agreed and we said, yay, we've got an international instrument that will help us deal with the climate change problem, because we all know it doesn't matter what the EU alone does, or it doesn't matter what Japan alone does. It's a collective problem. We need a collective solution. And we have that solution with the Paris Agreement. What was very clear about the Paris Agreement at that point is that the market mechanism, which is the Article 6 mechanism, was literally a last-minute bolt-on to the agreement. It was literally one of those things that people had to really, really push for at the very last minute to get it in.
Yeah.
So it's not like there was a uniform support around the use of market mechanisms when the Paris Agreement is agreed. So the fact that we had it was great news. And of course, it meant for those of us who dealt with the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms, emissions trading, joint implementation and the clean development mechanism, for those of us who had that experience, it was, well, this is going to be an evolution of that.
Yeah.
And that's great for what's going to be the Paris Agreement in due course. But then everybody said, but none of this is relevant until 2021. And it's like, okay, but that's all right. We saw the Kyoto Protocol go through this period where the agreement was agreed, but the CDM wasn't operational until 5 years later. It's still a lot happened in the meantime.
Yeah.
So presumably that's what will happen again. People will agree the Article 6 rule book, and even before 2021, on we go. But the Article 6 rule book never got agreed, right? And we therefore never had anything to do until 2021, where we basically had COP26 and we had the Glasgow decision, and Article 6 finally became operational. So between that period and 2021, in 2019, the voluntary market sort of stepped up to do what the Paris Agreement market mechanisms at that point were failing to do. So you had a big push from corporates to try and do what the governments were failing to do, to take corporate action, and the whole net zero commitments made by corporates began to bite. And because people were now looking for carbon offsets to help them meet some of their net zero commitments, the phone started ringing because people said, that guy we used to use 10 years ago when we last did this, is he still around? And of course, sooner or later, they find me here in Singapore and my phone starts ringing. Which is nice. This is always good to hear from old friends. But then we start saying, oh, okay, well, how much of my day was carbon until 2019? 10%. I never left the market completely, but it was a shrinking element of my business until the phone started ringing again in 2019. So in 2019, the phone started ringing. I said, yeah, I know how to do this. Let's do it. And then 2019, it started becoming a greater part of my business. And then by the time we hit the end of 2019, it's like, okay, so that's 6 solid months of me doing this. Maybe this isn't a pie in the sky fad that's going to disappear on me. Maybe this is real, right? So I started getting excited again. And then 2020 happened and it was continuing to grow. And it was like, okay, well, I can't do this alone anymore. I need to now bring new lawyers in to support me. But of course, in the last 10 years, between sort of 2012 and 2009 and 2019, there's been no legal reasons for lawyers to get engaged in carbon markets, because there hasn't been any carbon markets. What little bit of EU ETS market existed was pretty standardized. Most of it was traded as futures, and there was no OTC role for lawyers to play at that point. So how does a young lawyer cut their teeth on carbon markets? And the answer is nobody did. And therefore, there is nobody out there who has any legal experience. The most common question I got from clients in 2019 and 2020 is, can you find me a junior lawyer, maybe 3 years qualification, who has carbon markets experience? I had to say to them, that doesn't exist. There's just nobody out there who can do that. But of course, here I was building back a team to support the demand that we were seeing in the market. So I had to train the next generation of carbon market lawyers myself. And then I thought about the fact that, when I got into carbon markets 1.0, as they call it now, I inherited that market. I wasn't the architect of that market. I didn't build it.
Yeah.
Other people build it. I played in it. I learned in it. I grew with it, but I didn't design the foundational elements of it. And for the next generation of lawyers, the question is, what is my role? And I said to myself, well, if I don't have a role in building how this market, have a say in how this market grows, or contributing to the direction in which this market will go, then who will, right? Because it's incumbent upon me, as almost that last man standing, to contribute the experience that I have to help this market be more sustainable, more durable than the last market was.
Yeah.
And I decided that if I was going to bring in the next generation of lawyers and train them, and I now have a team of 5 who'd work directly with me on this, I don't want them to suffer the fate I had. I didn't want them to have the rug pulled out from under them 2 years into getting excited about it, falling in love with the subject the way I fell in love with the subject. So if we build it back, we need to build it back better. And one of the roles, therefore, I gave myself in this market, not that anybody told me I needed to play this role, was I felt that I had to contribute in a way that allowed the building back better to happen. There's no point building a market today that's going to fall upon its face in 2 years' time. So if we are going to make choices, if we are going to make decisions, we really should make the decisions that lead to the longevity of the market. You could almost say the sustainability of this market, because my past experience has shown me how quickly things can turn around if you're not very careful about things. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the judgment calls I have to make in the advice that I give, a lot of what I get to do is foretell where things might go in 4 years' time, in 5 years' time, because people want to invest capital and they need to know where the things are going to go. And in a lot of those judgment calls that I make judgment calls based on an assumption that people aren't going to make self-centered short-term decisions, and that they're going to make the decisions that are right for the market and the market overall. Now, that may be me being a bit naive about vested interests and how they play out in the real world, but it goes back to my point. What's the point building a market that isn't going to exist in 2 years' time, right? So that's kind of, if you will, a little bit of my vision of my role in Carbon Markets 2.0.
Peter, thanks for that. You gave some background really around that evolution of your journey, version 1.0 of Carbon Markets, version 2.0, and you talked about Paris Agreement.
Yep.
And so, I'd like to get your take around how that's evolving. You talked about the operationalization of Article 6 in particular, given the rule book was effectively defined at COP26. What are the types of discussions that you're having with clients right now as it relates to Article 6?
I think it's fair to say that people were hoping Article 6 would be fully operational already. Mm-hmm. COP26 was 2021. We're in 2024. 3 years have gone. We should be at the stage where we should have seen the first 6.4 project registered already. We should have been at the stage where the methodologies on what qualifies as the right type of project in the new world order of Article 6 is already known.
Yeah.
But we're in this weird place where, for various reasons, we don't know. And I think that's where it gets really challenging to talk about Article 6 without understanding or talking about geopolitics, right? Mm-hmm. And when I inherited the carbon markets in 1.0, I guess arguably the geopolitics were already done. Yes. And you were left dealing with whatever the consequence of the geopolitics are. But going back to my point about where we are today building a new Article 6 market in this example, the geopolitical story hasn't ended. We're still in the middle of it. And one of the most immediate takeaways, I guess, from COP28 was there is an imbalance in awareness and understanding between the negotiating parties about what the role of carbon markets is and their respective understanding as to why carbon markets work in their favor or don't work in their favor. Yeah. And actually the imbalance in that knowledge comes from the fact that there are countries who, during the Kyoto Protocol, had to deal with GHG accounting and reporting. They had to do the Paris Agreement reporting even then during the days of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. So they've got a 30-year head start on understanding what are the sources of their emissions, how to manage those sources of their emissions, and more importantly, how to put a price on their emissions. And yet you have another 160 odd countries who are now in the Paris Agreement context being asked to do the same thing, with none of those 30 years of background experience to draw upon or to benefit from. So there is that imbalance in understanding, in awareness, that then leads to the type of situation you got to at COP28, where the idea about what an Article 6 qualifying unit looks like, whether that's in the 6.2 context where you get an internationally transferred mitigation outcome, or whether or not that's in the Article 6.4 context where that mechanism produces a 6.4 emission reduction, the people's expectations and understanding of it were very different. And it kind of tells you that there is a naivety in the other 160 odd countries who don't have the experience that the 30 or 40 odd countries who participate in the original Kyoto Protocol framework have, which then allows them to have completely different expectations. And if you don't have a similar basis for reaching an agreement, and you're miles apart or poles apart in terms of your expectations and your understanding, then it's very difficult to see how you're going to reach a common position on things like this for the purposes of advancing Article 6, which then makes Article 6's delay a lot more understandable, but at the same time difficult because we're up against the clock. We need to move money into decarbonization. We're asking the Global South to do the decarbonization, whilst at the same time the Global North isn't pulling the necessary levers available to it to maximize its own potential. You only have to take the US as an example to say there is no carbon price in the US today.
Not federally.
Not at a federal level. And then you say, well, how are you therefore preaching to the rest of the world about what they should do in a circumstance where you're not even doing Article 6 transactions to financially support that transition there? And if you think you are genuinely supportive of it, then get this mechanism up and running.
Yeah.
Don't try and do things to procrastinate, to delay, to stop it from happening. It's already bad enough that we're in 2024 for a mechanism that should have been on the rule book back in 2016. But you missed that boat, and it's just been pushed out and pushed out and pushed out. And you've got to ask yourself, how come? Right? What's the driver for that? Why is that happening? And I think that's the biggest challenge of Paris Agreement markets as they stand today. So we are in this world where confusion around what Article 6 really means for people and what people want from it is causing Article 6 as a mechanism to go through these fits and starts. And if you genuinely want to deal with the climate change battle, you need to get on with it, right? Any project, any program you put together, even if you take nature-based removals as an example, will take 6 to 7 years before it delivers. So how do you not put money in today, knowing that it's really only 7 years before you get a return on that capital, before you can point to the environmental benefit itself? So if you're not keen about solving the climate problem, you procrastinate, you delay. If you're really keen about solving the climate problem, you don't let these issues win the argument, but lose the war.
Yeah.
Right? And we are in a war to solve the climate change problem. And there is a sense of urgency about it. And if you look at what's happening with Article 6, you don't feel that sense of urgency. So then that takes you quite neatly to the role, if you will, of the voluntary markets, right? And you know what? If the Article 6 markets can't get their act together, as was the case prior to 2021 when Article 6 guidelines were agreed, then the voluntary markets should step up. Well, now we're in this world where actually, some people say we don't need the voluntary markets. Offsets are bad things, and offsets are dodgy, and offsets don't have environmental benefits, and they're used as an excuse for corporates to take no action, right? All of those things. But actually what the voluntary market does in a way that the Paris Agreement Article 6 mechanism doesn't do is it allows the private sector to truly get involved in moving money and capital from the global north to help the global south decarbonize. And actually, therefore, the more you complicate the voluntary markets unnecessarily, the more you're reducing the opportunity, the window, and are depriving the global south of additional tools that allows them to feel supported in their decarbonization journey. So why are we therefore beating up the voluntary markets? Why are we not allowing the voluntary markets to be used as a channel to enable that global funding to flow? Article 6 funding isn't flowing. Paris Agreement funding is, okay, outside of Article 6 donor money. We know that the $100 billion a year target that was set in 2012 was never met even in 2020. So how are we going to get to 1.5 trillion, which is the number we're told that we needed annually to actually achieve the 1.5 decarbonization result? None of that is happening without private sector capital. And in fact, if you remember the presentation I did as the keynote speaker at Carbon Forward, there was a slide I used that illustrated the point that of that fund needed to achieve that decarbonization target, approximately 70% was going to come from the private sector. And if the Paris Agreement Article 6 tool and the donor money cycle are government-to-government plays, then the only way you get that 70% into the decarbonization approach at the moment is the voluntary markets. So the voluntary market has a very, very important role to play. But what are we doing with the voluntary market? We're basically clawing at it, kicking it. We're trying to get rid of it. We're not actually trying to help it grow. We can talk separately if you want to about some of the issues that have happened in the voluntary market and the merits around them. Mm-hmm. But the reality is the voluntary markets have a fundamentally important role to play if we want to succeed in this decarbonization journey. And that's because Europe or the US or the Western world decarbonizing alone isn't going to make the difference. We all have to decarbonize. Yes, we all decarbonize at a slightly different pace. And there has to be respect for the countries who are entitled to continue to grow. In other words, those are the countries that should be burning the remaining amount of our carbon budget. But instead, what we're seeing is that the people who have historically burnt the carbon budget, making the most of it while they still can. And that's kind of the geopolitics point in all of this.
So Peter, thank you for that. And effectively espousing on the importance of the role of voluntary carbon markets. Oftentimes, a lot of proponents in the market feel that the role of voluntary carbon markets is to fill that gap in between the compliance markets. But that assumes, as you said, that there are active policy discussions and active systems in place. But as you said, much of that is still, let's say, nascent. It's evolving. And we see different components, like I think, the stimulatory role of CBAM and others play. But nonetheless, voluntary markets play a really critical role in helping to raise that ambition and to channel finance to make that impact and engage the private sector, as you said. So now I want to kind of pull on that thread, if you'll indulge me. When we look at voluntary carbon markets, there's this complementarity and convergence, let's call it, between effectively what's a baseline and credit approach that is synergistic with the same approach under the Paris Agreement, certainly under 6.4.
Yeah.
And we get effectively different types of carbon credits.
Yeah.
So can you give us your take on this? It's a conversation that we had at Carbon Forward, and I'd really like to share with the audience.
Okay. Look, I mean, the voluntary carbon markets have to coexist with the Paris Agreement markets. And the bit that causes most people to struggle to understand why they have to coexist, number one, and why occasionally they trip over each other, has to do with ultimately the fact that historically carbon offsetting activity took place in countries that never had a legal obligation under the Kyoto Protocol to do anything.
Good point.
The Paris Agreement's changed that. We're all in it together. That's kind of the Paris Agreement ethos. But we're also all in it together at a differential pace with differentiated responsibilities. And therefore our NDCs, or our nationally determined contributions that we present our respective contributions in, are different. It's not a uniform one-size-fits-all approach that says we're all doing the same thing at the same time, and therefore the carbon price in one country must be this carbon price in the other country.
Yeah, but I think that the differentiated approach is critical, and that's the delineation between the old top-down model under a Kyoto system and under this effectively bottom-up approach under the Paris Agreement.
Absolutely. So in one sense, the simplest analogy is to say, well, if you think there's an overlap, or you think one can trip over the other, then one school of thought says, well, if my voluntary market activity occurs in a type of host country location that is not part of the host country's NDC, I don't see the trip up. I don't see the overlap.
Yeah.
So why are you worried about whether or not one is being double counted against the other? And that ultimately follows on from a bit of a misnomer out there, which is that people believe that NDC accounting and inventory accounting are the same thing. If you're a Paris Agreement member country who's gotten taken on obligations in respect of all of your gases, all of your sectors, then there's possibly no differentiation between your NDC and your inventory, right? But if you're a India or a Bangladesh or a Indonesia, and you are taking an NDC that progressively moves towards that, by definition, there is a difference between your inventory reporting and your NDC reporting, because the NDC inventory is a subset of your overall NDC. The issue that people talk about in terms of the overlap or duplication between the two is failing to recognize that if the NDC is a subset of the overall inventory, by definition, anything taking place outside of what that subset is cannot be part of the NDC, and therefore cannot be a duplication of effort, and therefore there's no question about double counting. But nobody's having that conversation. Everybody's sweeping it as if with really sweeping statements that say, if you have voluntary carbon credits that don't have corresponding adjustment, which is the tool used to try and rebalance the situation where there is a perception of overlap, then you must be double counting. But that's a blanket statement that is blatantly false, right? So then you take the other scenario, which is to say, well, if it's inside my NDC, what then? Well, even there you've got gradations. You have people who said, my NDC is conditional. It's conditional of carbon financing. If you don't give me carbon finance, it's not part of my carbon NDC, not part of my NDC. If you give me carbon finance, I'll make it part of my NDC. But it's a Paris Agreement carbon finance commitment, which means that the commitment for financing must come from governments. If it's a private sector contribution, that's not Paris Agreement finance. That's not NDC finance in the sense that the ways NDCs are written. So if I use the voluntary sector to enable me to meet my conditional NDC, because nobody else is funding me, it's raising ambition, right? I'm doing more. But if I have to do a corresponding adjustment, then you're suddenly penalizing me for doing that. So is that a good thing? Well, some would say, well, that boat has sailed, that train has left the station, we've already negotiated otherwise at COP26. And I think that negotiation was based on that imbalance in understanding that I was referring to earlier on.
Yeah.
But we're stuck with that, right? That's kind of where it is. So now you're back to this point where it says, well, in which case, if I'm doing voluntary carbon accounting, which is not part of the Article 6 accounting rulebook, why do I then need to do a corresponding adjustment for a voluntary unit to be good, so to speak? And the answer to that is also very simple. A corresponding adjustment is not a proxy for integrity. If the quality of the project, if the quality of the activity is good enough, it's good enough with or without a corresponding adjustment. If you recognize that a corresponding adjustment is essentially a penalty on the host country, because what you're doing is requiring the country to make up the ton to meet its NDC artificially, because you've taken out a ton that you didn't need to take out, then you're basically saying to the host country, the ton that you just did, I'm going to discount that by 50% and make you make up another one. So in effect, what you're doing is you're discounting the contribution to the GHG mitigation done in the host country when you insist that the host country has to do a corresponding adjustment, when in fact it doesn't have to. So it acts as a penalty on the host country. And that's what Article 6 has now insisted on. Mm-hmm. The voluntary market, thankfully, has not yet suffered that plague, despite the fact that people have in some categories of people have insisted that it is necessary. I am one of those people who doesn't believe it is necessary. And actually, when you think it's not necessary, it opens up all of this avenues for climate finance to move into the voluntary space, which accelerates the global South's ability to do carbon financing. And it brings the private sector into it in the way that Article 6 markets up till now have horribly failed to do. Yeah. So it really then starts translating into a successful tool to achieve the climate problem. But it goes back to my point. If we really want to solve the climate problem, we shouldn't be hunting for the issues in the market that drag the carbon market down. We should be genuinely finding ways to improve on what we have without necessarily being destructive in the process. Mm-hmm. So to your point about the convergence of voluntary markets with carbon markets, with Article 6 markets, well, I've just given you an example or a scenario where voluntary markets run in parallel with Article 6 markets. But there is another scenario where voluntary carbon credits are used increasingly for compliance use. And by compliance use, I don't always mean Article 6 use. It could be CORSIA, which is the carbon offsetting mechanism for the international aviation market. And actually, that leads to a very interesting question I quite often get, which is, what's the difference between a voluntary carbon credit that meets the CORSIA requirements, and a Paris Agreement credit? And it's a very technical question to answer, because they're completely three separate, independent frameworks. But the line between these frameworks is being blurred by various market developments. So one example would be the CORSIA market saying, I recognize Paris Agreement units, as I mentioned earlier, but also I'm going to recognize certain qualifying voluntary carbon credits, provided that they can satisfy me that there is no double counting of these credits in the context of either voluntary markets or the Paris Agreement markets. And CORSIA as a standard, I don't have a tool to deal with double counting, so I'm going to borrow the tool that the Article 6 market has, which is the corresponding adjustment we talked about earlier, and I'm going to apply that in my space, even though I'm not the Paris Agreement, and I'm going to insist that the country offering the voluntary carbon credit to me has to have a corresponding adjustment. And then you get to this question, well, isn't that a Paris Agreement unit? Because a Paris Agreement unit also has a corresponding adjustment. So you get into crossover issues and things that are overlay issues, but they are three completely separate frameworks. One's voluntary, one's under the ICAO treaty, and the other is under the Paris Agreement. So you cannot automatically say that just because one qualifies for one, it automatically qualifies for the other. So there has to be a bridge that brings those two together.
And what is that bridge?
So the bridge is the bit that people find most difficult to understand. So through the process of trying to explain this, I've now got to the point where I've simplified it to the point where we look at a glass of water over there, and we look at this bottle of, middle bottle, which is a locally produced bottle of mineral water, and we look at the very well-known brand of bottle here known as Evian. And I say to you, René, which of these three things do you think is the most expensive?
This one.
The Evian. And I say to you, why do you say that?
Well, packaging, brand recognition, and the trust. It's regulated across different markets.
Right. But all three of these things are ultimately containing water, right?
Exactly. They have that commonality.
So the function of what they do, which is to quench your thirst, is the same whether I package it as Evian or I package it as a local bottle of mineral water, or if I just take tap water and put it in a glass. You're still going to achieve the objective of not being thirsty after you've drunk it. So why would you pay more for one for the satisfaction of the same feeling, right? And actually, for me, that's the point where you say there's a certain attribute or quality about the Evian water that inspires you or drives you or gives you more confidence to want to pay more. And the sense of confidence that you have will be personal to you.
Yeah.
If you think that the domestically produced mineral water is as good as the Evian produced mineral water, great, you'll pay the same price for both. But in fact, if you genuinely believe that there's a qualitative difference between the two, maybe you could say the Evian water is taken from the natural springs in the Alps, as an example.
Sure.
And you think that Alps spring water is clearer than 7-time filtered, treated water, which might be the basis of this, locally produced mineral water. And you think that I want the governance framework, the stringency of the quality, the marketing experience that comes with that product. And that's why I'm paying more for that. How many times have you gone on a holiday and not drunk local water, and you've gone for a familiar brand of water that you've ever bought before?
Yeah, many times.
Right? Many times.
Yeah.
And if you ask yourself, why do you do that thing differently? Well, the answer is there's something about the qualitative nature which is definable in the context of a Paris Agreement ton that is different from a voluntary carbon unit that just happens to benefit from a corresponding adjustment. So if you take these three things, the analogy breaks down to That's the voluntary carbon unit without a corresponding adjustment, the glass of water. This is the voluntary carbon unit, but it has a corresponding adjustment and it's produced domestically. And this is the ITMO, or the 6.4 ER, that's gone through high quality checks, overseen by the supervisory board of the Article 6.4 mechanism, or it's been through at least a bilateral oversight between two countries who've decided to cooperate together to create a 6.2 unit. So there's a sort of qualitative confidence that you get from this, which is the reason why you pay more for this, right? And for me, that's the difference between a voluntary carbon unit with a corresponding adjustment that is recognized by CORSIA, and an ITMO. Now, the question is, there are people in the market who will say, this can become this if I get a corresponding adjustment. There are also people who say that because this has a corresponding adjustment, it's the same as this.
It's equivalent to that, yeah.
But that doesn't sort of fit with what your impression of why you're paying more for the Evian is.
Sure.
Right?
But it depends also on the audience, like who is the buyer? In this case, arguably on this side, it's the big G, right? The governments who are also in this pool of liquidity.
Yeah. So if you think about CORSIA, I like using them as an example because they're somewhere in between the corporate demand and the government demand.
Yeah.
CORSIA says, I'm willing to take both, right? They're in the middle. I'll take from here and I'll take from there. But either way I take it, I
must have the corresponding.
I'm concerned about double counting, so I'm going to request a corresponding adjustment. So the common theme in all of that is that the ITMO has a corresponding adjustment. This has a corresponding adjustment, which is really a payment to the government.
Yes.
So if it's a payment to the government, that's not changing the quality of it.
And a pure voluntary instrument does not.
And for the reasons we talked about earlier, the pure voluntary instrument doesn't need the corresponding adjustment. In fact, the pure voluntary instrument with the corresponding adjustment, which is what CORSIA is asking for, is essentially that.
Yes.
Right? So the argument really is that the ton reduced, which is the water used to quench your thirst, is the same. What changes is the packaging. So actually the label you attach to it, the package you put in it, the framework that therefore takes it beyond the actual production of the water or the source of the water is what differentiates it. And that differentiates the price, that differentiates the demand, that differentiates the supply as well.
Yes.
So the convergence happens in an example like CORSIA. The convergence also happens in an example where Article 6.2, where Singapore collaborates with Ghana, and they both agree that the Vera unit produced, as an example, with a corresponding adjustment is good enough in their opinion for it to be an ITMO. Not in Ghana's individual opinion, but in the combined opinions of these two countries who've decided to collaborate with
Which is what you said earlier around this distinction around Article 2 and the interpretation of this bilateral 6.2 and this kind of misnomer around the unilateral decision-making. Once it's validated because of this bilateral.
So a unilateral 6.2 with a corresponding adjustment is no different than the VCU with a corresponding adjustment. And there are people who are arguing that that is the way to go. But that means that then this thing has to be something different. Otherwise, why are you saying that Evian is better than the local mineral water? And actually, that analogy is the simplest way to explain what is otherwise a very complicated, very convoluted argument.
And a very nuanced argument.
And a very nuanced argument.
Wonderful insights, and thank you for distilling, excuse the pun, but the analogy here of what's of highly nuanced subject matter and lending your expertise and expert lens to something that is a little bit more relatable to folks. And hopefully, I think the audience can benefit from that perspective. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
I hope what you say transpires to be true, because it's such a technical subject full of so much jargon with so much history as well, right? And it's history, oddly enough, that a Google search doesn't allow you to go back to, because it happened more than 10 years ago. So there's a lack of source material that the new carbon markets participants can't access, because Google search engines no longer keep stuff that's more than 10 years old, right? So in one sense, I land up becoming by default the archive of knowledge and experience and then I draw upon occasionally when issues come up. And I say, yeah, we came across this issue before. I don't see any reason why we didn't reinvent the wheel. This is the answer. And then somebody turns around and says, yeah, that was CDM stuff. None of that was good. None of that was useful. So we're going to discount all of that. But I think that's also being a bit...
That's dismissive, and
It's
it's
dismissive.
naivety of like a recency bias,
Yeah.
which I think often belies sort of the reflection of the kind of constituents in the market, right? Where there's a re-engagement from new participants coming in, effectively not having that older context. But so thank you for being that archivist and effectively that teacher to effectively pass on those lessons, because we don't have to reinvent that wheel.
Yeah, and it goes back to my sort of comment about me trying to create an environment for the next generation of carbon lawyers to find fruitful and confident markets in which to invest their time, invest their effort, and actually have a sustainable business, a sustainable practice for themselves. Because if they don't do it, then I don't know how we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the insights and thank you for the time. And I'm actually going to drink to that from here.
Well, cheers. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.